So today we'll be discussing about the low Middle Ages and more specifically the talking a little bit because it's a huge topic we can cover in one video about the ideological weapons that the papacy and the empire used against each other at the times of Frederick II. This is a very important topic because not just because of the ideological implications and obviously the huge theoretical speculations and the consequences in law, in culture and so on, but also because we're talking about concrete powers, powers that were some of the greatest at the times. Take papacy. Papacy had reached the peak of um, of temporal power, actually, since the end of the 12th century and in beginning of the 13th century. So in the times in which Frederick was still first a minor and then a young emperor, in a certain sense adopted by the papacy itself to carry on um, papal ideology. Um, and the popes had a huge power all over Western Christendom in a very effective, very political, very temporal way. This had been the result of centuries of struggles between Rome and the Holy Roman Empire, and they had ended with substantially, in spite of all ambiguities that always remained, could be always newly employed to revive this fight, had been won um, by the Pope. Um, the empire in this time was, a really great power, definitely to be reckoned with. However, it had lived a phase of transition. Um, as I said before, Frederick had been, um, you know, um, when he was still a minor, he remained an orphan. mm. So basically, he had to become the emperor in charge, but basically his dominions were ruled by others. So there was a phase in which the Pope thought to use the young Frederick as their man essentially, and to make him a very obedient emperor, um, subservient to papal needs. The problem is that Frederick was Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, so one of the most amazing characters, figures, personalities of medieval history, a huge mind, a person with great ambitions, with great intellectual skills and curiosity, and he felt very much these spiritual, the problems deriving from the spiritual and temporal problems, um, and we'll see how he would have reacted. Um, and therefore, these two powers entered in collision essentially for one reason: that Frederick had inherited a freaking huge patrimony from his parents. He was King of Sicily, Duke of Swabia, later King of Germany, King of the Romans, then King of Italy, and Holy Roman Emperor. So whichever his politics was, it was evident that this man had the greatest power of Western world in his hands, and in particular the papacy, which was rooted in its temporal domains in central Italy, saw itself surrounded by Frederick, and obviously had to struggle to keep its prerogatives um, free from imperial ingerence. And Frederick obviously didn't obey to the Pope, or better, he wished he had obeyed, but the Pope really wanted basically to guide him in a way that he wasn't free to exercise his legitimate powers, and therefore the empire and the papacy entered from the 30s of the 13th century once again into a clash. And we can say that first of all the church won even this time at the end. Not only because Frederick died before the the papacy was was still fighting against him, or because he had been defeated and was declining, but also because he had probably played his cards. I can't say in a worse way, but let's say that with more um, uncertainty probably than what the popes had showed. The popes had a very clear path, intolerant in a way, but it was a singular path. The empire had instead to basically reinvent a bit the conceptual and operative, practices in politics, in policies to deal with this new situation. Um, Gregory the Ninth and Innocence the Fourth, which were the bitterest of Frederick's enemies on the papal seat, in fact were extremely clear in using, politically speaking, and at its fullest, the bureaucracy of Gregorian origin, so the ones of the clash for investitures, and to move through their own power the whole the whole Christian world against Frederick. The Pope made many councils showing to the Christians that this emperor wasn't fit, that he was the Antichrist, that he was fighting against the church, and that he was basically the enemy of Christendom as a whole. And and it gained obviously a consistent help, because telling the truth, the situation was a bit ambiguous, even politically at the time. Kings were busy in their own regards, but let's say that when Pope called, obviously there were lots of political powers who saw the situation fit to disobey the emperor. So the greatest threats that Frederick in this sense had to deal against were obviously the disobedience of the German princes that during his minor age obviously had begun follow fiercely autonomous policies, eating up everything they could, while royal power was disgregating in Germany, was being disintegrated, and therefore the papal support towards these guys really didn't help them. It didn't help Frederick. And Frederick, how did Frederick react ideologically, conceptually? Well, Frederick, first of all, he wasn't a single man. He had a court, for instance, so he had an intellectual means. He had ideological means, propaganda means as well. But let's say that there was apparently an ambiguity, mm, relatively to the conception of imperial power, which were eradicated in imperial power in itself, in a way, because imperial power in Western Europe had never been fully in charge of the situation. Fredericks' father and grandfather had been almost capable of um, building something greater, to really reunite the East and the West. Think that Henry VI was about to conquer Constantinople in at the end of the 12th century. But the imperial power proper, that is the one rooted in a singular place, like it had been Germany, at the beginning, had always been weak. We can even say that it was exactly the effort to build a universal dominion that actually made Germany failing in its in the process of its national monarchy, in the building of a national monarchy. Um, and the problem was also deeper towards the papacy, because, you know, how was temporal power really related to papacy? Did the emperors have to obey temporally the pope? Did the emperors have the right to interfere with papal policy in turn and see, who was fit or not to be on St. Peter's seat? And this was obviously worsened by the fact that Frederick had been, in a certain way, at the beginning, the loyal servant of the papacy. Just think about Innocence III, who was basically his adoptive father. And Frederick himself probably wasn't, um, you know, was innerly troubled as well. To between these different suggestions, there is a certain current that wants to see him as a very cold-blooded and decided and decisional man, but we have to think that that wasn't a world that could allow a singular policy, a singular way. I think the greatest and the greatness of Frederick really laid into the ability of managing many things at once, and in a certain way in shaping even accordingly to what the obstacles were, to at least being still able to manage all the rest at the time. And also Frederick, there are people who quite erroneously say that he was an atheist. Frederick II was not an atheist at all, at all. He was a good Christian. He was still fully a man of his times. We can argue whether with Frederick's death, universalism, as at least it had been known, especially in the 13th century, died. But we can't really think of Frederick as a Christian emperor who really did have concerns towards the relationship with papacy and ultimately with God's judgment. Um, However, at the same time, this great Federation power also expressed not just into the traditional conception um, of a just temporal and political role of the empire, opposed to the spiritual sphere, um, um, mm, which with which only the Pope had to deal. But he also started building another conception that it wasn't really new, but it was never in the Christian world, but it was definitely important and very meaningful at the time, especially in those conditions in which he had a huge empire that could potentially become a fully universal one in Christendom. That is the concept of um, a religious authority of the prince. Mm? Um, this is very important because the concept of a religious authority means that the emperor has influence also in the organization of the church and in spiritual affairs. And obviously you understand that for a papacy that had gloriously came out of the fight against the emperors, claiming their temporal and spiritual power um, basically at its fullest, at least from their own perspective, an emperor started saying, not only I am fully in charge of the temporal affairs, but I'm also with a religious authority. Well, that this was a very serious situation, especially when he ruled half of Western Europe, and not only that. Um, so it's very important to understand this because Frederick, as I said, didn't invent really anything new. But even if his project, his politics failed, and with it, the whole Hohenstaufen history became declining irreversibly. The idea of prince with a religious power was embraced by many other rulers, some of which weren't even Holy Roman emperors. Take at the beginning of the 14th century what Philip the Fourth of France did. He was king of France and basically started claiming that the French monarchy had a religious authority as well. No wonder Boniface the Eighth excommunicated him. And this thing lived on because it was a conception that also helped to shape the the concept of the ideological monarchies, not just through the Middle Ages but also during the modern age. Um, there is another beautiful work of Kantorovic's, which is named "The King's Two Bodies," and he deals essentially with this. That is that there was a spiritual body that really had powers that went beyond the temporal, just the temporal sphere. And as well as the Pope had called the Council of Lyon against Frederick, also Frederick, called for the solidarity of the secular European princes in face of the ingerence that the apostolic seat was having on temporal affairs of his own as an emperor, and especially accentuated the idea of an imperial universalism centered in Rome. So in the same seat the popes had built their power, in opposition in fact to the religious papal universalism. Uh, and this was quite important politically speaking, not just because he evidently wanted to really substitute the imperial power in the center of Rome, so trying to rebuild the Roman Empire, um, giving Rome not just that spiritual, religious, Christian importance, but also a markedly political, imperial importance. but also because in more concrete terms this affected his policies towards the papacy. You can understand, for instance, why Frederick, in spite of fighting bitterly against the papacy, never elected anti-popes. His ancestors had done that. There was a pope that went against the emperor. Fine, the emperor elected an anti-pope because he said that's the real pope. That's the one not only I certify for because I am the emperor, but that has to be followed as an alternative to that other pope that is bothering me and that is not fit for his office. Frederick didn't do that because he believed that the unity of Christendom and of the empire didn't require fights on the religious plan by opposing a pope to another, because that would have meant to to be to appear weak as a ruler, because if he was in charge also of spiritual affair and he had a religious authority, what for electing another pope that was not the emperor but a copy of the pope? He was the emperor. He could manage these affairs um, on Saint Peter's soil. Um, and at the same time, always regarding Frederick's policies, the emperor um, pushed for a new ecclesiastical reform, which followed the model of the so-called primitive church and of apostolic life. Um, what did this mean? That obviously he was pushing for reforming the church in a way that it would abandon its temporal prerogatives. He wanted a church that was like the primitive one, like the one of the apostles, which had a purely, I can't say a purely evangelical mission, because obviously the church had to be organized in a certain way, but a church that didn't interfere into the political sphere, you know. The emperors do what they have to do, also because God has put them in charge. The church matters about, praying and supporting spiritually and helping the poor and all this stuff, but doesn't go to the emperor telling him what he has or doesn't have to do in his own temporal sphere. And this was a very important ideological weapon against the Church of Rome, um, which was, we can say, coherent with the continuous demands of the so-called regnum to the church, because they were essentially claiming what it was in their own right, at least in theory. Church, you have to do what you're meant to do. Let the emperor do the emperor, and let it do it fully. you know. And however, this is what I believe, is that Frederick really didn't have the opportunity to fully deal with all the problems that he had, basically, most of which were obviously caused by the church. So these responses, in their in their ambiguity, in their because we have really to interpret this. Frederick wasn't just dealing with church. He really had a lot of problems, wars, fighting with northern Italian cities, dealing with the crusade problems, trying to keep things in balance in Germany. So a lot of, and there are lots of other things that such as I don't know, the Mongols arriving at doors of Germany, and the whole Europe devastated by this fear that it was the end of the world, and obviously a pope that told Christianity that the emperor in charge was an antichrist. Well, this surely didn't help. But this was a very big thing. There is a lot of debate on whether Frederick had, in fact, even with all its powers, the actual strength to dominate Western Christendom and to build up a universal dominion. Some people say, well, theoretically yes, probably if he had changed something in the policy with, especially in Italy. Others say he couldn't really, he could save what he had in terms of maybe of a kingdom in southern Italy, but things in Germany were basically lost, and we could see that even from his own policy in Germany, that that the northern Italian cities were basically too developed and too strong to be just told them what they had to do. I don't want to answer this question for now, telling what my opinion is. But what I'm suggesting relatively to this conceptual, oscillation and ambiguity of Frederick, the cause might have been effectively that um, it wasn't all about the attitude towards the church, but there were bigger problems, more material problems that I'm not saying that this ideology and propaganda weren't useful. They were extremely useful, but and there was also much else in terms of military and political problems um, that can really make us forgive Frederick for not having formulated a clear and precise um, political ideology. Towards the idea of empire and of the church. I don't know how clear it was. Sometimes I have difficulties to find the right words and to express properly the concept that I have in mind. But I think it's also a bit about this continuous reflection, and not really on arriving to a particular point, but always leaving a question, an interrogative point to whether we can fully understand what happened in those days, if certain things ever be found out, if we can, as historians, really express a definitive judgment. And I'd say it's better wondering this than saying, oh yeah, I found the answer. So thanks for listening.